People lacking motivation often think that they're lazy, dull, have some low-grade mental condition, or even that they're just plain pathetic. And age is no barrier. I recently heard a 21-year-old describe themselves as lazy. Yet in all my years' experience, I've never come across someone genuinely lazy. Unmotivated? Certainly. Lazy? No. And perhaps a story from my early days as a woodwork teacher in the western suburbs of Sydney will illustrate what I mean. I was straight up handed a class of delinquent 14-year-olds in my first year. I was told that they would make me or break me, and no assistance was offered. It was obvious I was supposed to just suck it up and somehow get control of these kids. And my success would not be measured in educational terms because no one expected them to learn anything. I would be victorious if I could just get them to behave, and they didn't want it. My first class was a disaster by any measure. A kid who was physically bigger and stronger than me lunged at me with a chisel, and my reflex action was to throw my arms up around my face in defence. Fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, one of my hands crunched into his neck, causing him to stagger backwards. He tripped on a school bag that should never have been there. He fell over that backwards and knocked himself out. Of course, it looked to everyone like I had taken on the biggest kid in the class and shown him who was the boss by whacking him. When he came to, even he thought I'd punched him deliberately. Well, in the ensuing shock, I sat the kids down and offered them a two-part deal. Speaking in hushed tones, I promised them I would teach them how to make kayaks, a huge deal in the early 1970s. I also said they could come and camp in my front yard during the holidays and paddle their kayaks up and down the river that I lived on for the whole week of the holidays. In return, they had to do absolutely as I instructed within the classroom. They also had to call me sir and say please and thank you every time I spoke. And they readily agreed that I would never have to raise my voice to them. Well, the transformation was as total as it was shocking. Those kids suddenly had something to be getting on with. Talk about motivated. They turned up to class early and they stayed late. They learnt that helping each other made for better speed on their own job. They started teaching themselves how to mix and apply fiberglass like an expert. They spent days tracking down cheap supplies. They organised to stay back after school to work on their boats. They turned their mistakes into learning. They were having fun, mate. Without a plan, they reinvented themselves, turning from delinquent, abusive adolescents into purposeful, respectful and determined young men. Along the way to building their kayaks, they started liking the new version of themselves. The project was easily 6 months, which for many of them was as long as they ever stuck with anything, so they learnt persistence, stickability and tenacity. Even though it's been 40 plus years since those days, I still know a number of those kids quite well, and they recall that shift in glowing terms. Yet if we step outside the story, it's not difficult to understand why those kids went from lazy to amazing under their own steam. Let's face it, threatening those kids could never have generated that result. The only event of any consequence is that they saw a bargain and they went for it. They might have been lazy and constantly looking to do the minimum. That's probably because they saw no personal benefit in making an effort. School for them was just a pain in the ass, trying to learn stuff that they didn't want to know from people they didn't like for reasons they didn't respect. But they were smart. They saw a way of getting something they wanted, and even though it involved hard work and long hours, they still thought it was the deal of the century and they went for it with everything that they could bring to it. Now, I'm not saying it was all beer and Skittles, but it beat the heck out of every other class they were involved in. Now, why is their story relevant to you? Well, underneath all our differences, there are some startling similarities. Lack of motivation is most often a lack of interest in what someone is telling us we should be excited about. When there's no obvious personal benefit, when we can't clearly see why we would want to do something, of course we're not going to be motivated. Your engine usually won't start when you want it to fire up about something you don't care about. And let's face it, not many of us get all hot under the collar for commuting to work or disciplining the kids or cleaning out the shed, mostly because there are about a gazillion more things we'd rather be doing. We just don't feel like doing the dreary thing, even though we know we have to do it. I'm not in the mood rapidly mixes with but you have to and forms into a smelly soup that feels ugly and uncomfortable. But we think we have to be excited about stuff that's as boring as batshit. Literally, how often have you given yourself an uppercut for being lazy or avoiding something that's about as exciting as selling vasectomies door to door? Our main problem is that we've discovered a bunch of so-called motivators that haven't worked. It's okay to train harder at the gym when the upbeat music is blaring, but it's like you're a different person once you're back at the office. It's inspiring to hear motivational speeches, but it's deflating to get to the car park and find your car busted. It sort of works when you yell at yourself to get your ass in gear, but it sucks that you know you aren't going to keep it up any longer than the yelling. It kind of gets you going to make public promises and be accountable for doing something that everyone cheers you on about. But it drives you batty to know you just can't do that because you should. The sad truth is you can wait years to feel like it and never have the motivation turn up by itself. You can sit on your lounge waiting for motivation to walk down the street, knock on your door and ask to be allowed in, but you're going to be waiting in vain. Motivation never turns up because we want it to. You can wait for it, but you also know you're wasting your time. If you look deeply enough at this concept, it becomes clear that we're waiting to suddenly fall in love with doing something that we were never going to fall in love with in the first place. Therefore, it's your assignment to figure out two keys. One, what would be good for you to do for you because you'd feel better about you if you did it? And two, is to find the attitude that makes it an exciting part of the new you, like those kids did all those years ago.